All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the military logic, the very real economic risks, and the stark historical realities of a hypothetical U.S. ground invasion of Iran. Look, this is a deeply complex, fast-moving situation, so we're going to rely on the hard data, historical precedents, and top-tier strategic analysis from our sources to figure out exactly what's at stake here. So, with Operation Epic Fury, that combined U.S. and Israeli air campaign already lighting up the skies and hitting Iranian infrastructure, we have to tackle the massive question on everyone's mind. What happens if this aerial bombardment actually turns into a full-scale ground war? I know early statements from officials aim to downplay a ground conflict, but honestly, given the sheer scale of the operation and the escalating retaliations, a ground incursion is becoming a very real military possibility. Now, military strategists aren't actually talking about occupying the whole country. The main target? It's critical infrastructure, specifically places like Karg Island, right up in the northern Arabian Gulf. And the reason for that is pretty simple. This one tiny island handles a mind-blowing 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. Grab that and you basically choke off the regime's entire economic engine. But actually holding on to that territory, that is a whole different ballgame. Any invading force is going to run smack into Iran's mosaic strategy. This isn't your standard top-down military structure. It's a highly decentralized defense doctrine literally designed to bleed out an occupying army. It's built so local commanders can just keep fighting, trading land for time, and wearing down the enemy through sheer attrition, even if Tehran gets completely cut off. Because of this setup, U.S. troops wouldn't be fighting huge conventional battles. We're talking about a brutal, asymmetric grind. You're up against hardcore, battle-tested IRGC and Basij militias who know American tactics inside and out. You've got massive swarms of those first-person view drones, the exact kind that completely changed the game in Ukraine. Throw in minefields and incredibly harsh mountainous terrain in a country roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, and well, it's a nightmare scenario for ground troops. And that brings us to a really haunting historical parallel, the 2003 Iraq War. We all remember the swift initial victory there, right? Saddam Hussein fell incredibly fast. But as our sources point out, that quick win instantly descended into a bloody, decade-long quagmire of insurgency and nation-building. Iran is way bigger and way more populated than Iraq. Going in risks creating an Iraq 2.0, where taking the ground is the easy part, but holding and governing it becomes an inescapable trap. Plus, we can't look at this in a vacuum. There is a deep, painful history of Western imperialism in the region. For the Iranian people, foreign intervention goes all the way back to the 1953 coup, when the US and UK ousted Prime Minister Mossadegh, mostly to maintain control of Iranian oil. Understanding this historical context is absolutely crucial, because it tells us exactly why an invasion today would almost certainly trigger fierce nationalistic resistance, rather than people welcoming foreign troops. Which brings us to the international fallout. From a legal standpoint, red flags are flying everywhere. International law experts are stressing that a ground invasion blatantly violates the UN Charter. Just look at what Luis Moreno Ocampo, the founding chief prosecutor of the ICC, has to say here. He argues that framing this as a war of choice basically tears up the rules-based international order, drawing some pretty stark comparisons to other modern geopolitical land grabs. So we have to neutrally examine the core debate happening globally right now. On one hand, you have proponents arguing that crushing the regime's military and nuclear capabilities is a totally justified punishment for a hostile state that's destabilizing the region. But on the flip side, critics are calling it modern imperialism. They argue that seizing Iranian land, especially oil-rich assets like Karg Island, is just straight-up stealing resources from the Iranian people and repeating those exact historical traumas we just looked at. Moving on to Section 1, the geopolitical chessboard, how great powers capitalize on the chaos. Because a conflict like this, it absolutely does not stay confined to the Middle East. It's a massive strategic earthquake on the global stage. By dragging U.S. aircraft carriers, troops, and political bandwidth into an Iranian quagmire, America's rivals get a huge opening. For Beijing, it weakens U.S. deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, especially around Taiwan. That's exactly why China is actively feeding around intelligence and rocket parts to keep them in the fight. And for Moscow, any distraction that pulls American resources away from Ukraine is a distinct, massive win for them. Which leads us to Section 2, the domestic front, the perspective of the American voter. At the end of the day, wars run on the political will of the people paying for them. And right now, public resistance in the U.S. is just overwhelming. Look at this polling from March 2026. Only a meager 7% of Americans actually support a large-scale ground war. 7%. And look at the second line. A staggering 55% of Americans are completely opposed to sending any ground troops to Iran. There's basically zero appetite for another Middle Eastern entanglement, especially when nearly half the country is already highly anxious about simply affording fuel. And speaking of costs, the financial toll is staggering. American lawmakers are currently fighting tooth and nail over a massive $200 billion war supplemental bill, trying to push through $200 billion for a foreign war of choice, while voters back home are getting heavily burdened by the cost of living, is causing massive friction in Congress. We're even seeing some lawmakers outright refusing to authorize any ground operations whatsoever. And that economic pain, it's not some far-off theory. It is immediate. With the Strait of Hormuz jammed up by the conflict, everyday Americans are already seeing gas prices absolutely surge at the pump. When you disrupt global energy flows like this, shipping costs skyrocket, the price of goods goes up, and you're staring down the barrel of a very real global economic recession if this drags out. And finally, Section 3, unintended consequences, the only certainty in Middle Eastern conflict. If there's one historical truth we have to recognize as we analyze all of this, it's that you cannot just smash a system and expect to control where the pieces fall. Just like how invading Iraq inadvertently created a vacuum that birthed ISIS, putting boots on the ground in a country of 90 million people with deep proxy networks risks sparking an endless multi-front insurgency. We'd be looking at a collapsed global oil supply chain, a massive spike in transnational terrorism, and a completely destabilized region that could take decades to repair. It really forces us to confront the absolute limits of military power. It brings to mind that haunting, fundamental question General David Petraeus famously asked during the height of the Iraq War: "Tell me how this ends." If there's no clear, achievable off-ramp, military action just spirals into a permanent conflict. Taking an island might be achievable on paper, but what exactly is the plan for day 2 or year 2? So, as we weigh the strategic justifications against the catastrophic realities of a ground invasion, the brutal asymmetric warfare, the massive public backlash, the strategic gifts to China and Russia, and the immediate economic shock, you really have to ask yourself, even if the tactical military goals can actually be met, is this a victory the world can afford?